Welcome, everyone. I want to thank you for dealing with my tardiness here this evening, but we are underway. So I think we can get started. As you can see, I've titled this session the Best Laid Plans of Mice and Men, because even if you do everything right, if you have a stellar planning, a mistake-free implementation, in the end, we're still growing plants. And of course, we can't control the weather, the critters, disease pressures, eminent domain, or any other potential obstacle that might derail our planting. So with that being said, this whole session is going to be about planning so that we can reduce or eliminate those issues that other growers that have come before you might have endured. So what is your goal? Now, this is a theme throughout this presentation, and I bring it up time and time again because your goal will focus and dictate some of the decisions you make. For example, are you simply looking to provide some additional wildlife cover or food? Well, then you might look at seedlings from the Iowa State Forest Nursery, and they're a great source for native hazelnut shrubs. The same could be said for hazelnuts grown in agroforestry settings. So think of shelter belts, windbreaks, things like that. Seedlings from the Iowa State Forest Nursery are going to do well. Maybe you're just looking simply for some nuts for your own consumption. And in that case, you might look at some of the hybrids that have the larger nuts and the thinner shells than the Native American hazelnuts. But then if you're looking to grow hazelnuts as a potential specialty perennial crop in a production model, you certainly want to be looking at cultivars, which we will have more of in due time, or at least some of these experimental genotypes that are becoming more and more available. So tonight we're going to use this enterprise worksheet that is part of the hazelnut chapter of the Landowner's Guide to Perennial Crop Options. This document is available on our Trees Forever website if you do a search for Landowner's Guide to Perennial Crop Options. So using this enterprise worksheet, we're going to go through planning so that you can have success. So we're going to talk about site selection. For instance, do you even have a piece of ground that will grow hazelnuts successfully? Then we're going to get into the big issue and what everyone wants to know, plant material. Then from there, we're going to move on to site prep and layout. And then I'll go through some examples of some plantings that I've done to demonstrate some options for growers. So finally, establishment and site management to a certain degree, we're going to talk about, but we're going to really take a look at this breakdown of the enterprise worksheet. Well, before that, I should mention that some of the sections of this worksheet are just going to be covered more in depth in future sessions. I want to present them within the overall context, or provide some context, I guess you should say, but some of the specifics we're going to get to in the weeks ahead. So if I skip over some of them, just don't feel like I'm missing something or I forgot something. They'll be more in depth in sessions 4 or 5. Okay, so the first part of the worksheet is some assumptions that were made when we developed this. Now, this is about 10 years old, and I'm in the process of updating it. And so hopefully with the new edition of the Landowner's Guide for Perennial Crop Options, we'll have some updated figures and perhaps even some new resources. But and then we're going to be doing 2 other crops too. So that document incidentally lays out enterprise worksheets, or pardon me, it focuses on 6 crops. So you have black walnuts, chestnuts, and hazelnuts. Then you have your elderberries, your aronia berries, and then Christmas trees. And we're going to add to it with pecans and honeyberries. So look for that this summer and fall. So back to the worksheet here. We assumed a planting density of 580 plants per acre. We looked at total rows of 2,899 linear feet, a yield of 2 pounds per plant, a price of $1 per pound, and a labor cost of $10 an hour. Well, you can see this is a little bit dated with that labor of $10 an hour, but anyways, this equates to an estimated yield then, as you can see there, of roughly 1,160 pounds of nuts per year. Again, this is assuming 100% usable nuts, which probably isn't a valid assumption, but we'll get to that. And then at $1 per pound, we're looking at $1,160 in gross revenue. Now you'll notice that I provide a range for just about all of the various categories throughout the worksheet. And that's because there is significant variability between costs on many things. And I don't think we should ever underestimate the ingenuity of our growers and ways that they may be able to reduce costs essentially across these sectors. So this is it for the income section. I don't want to spend any more time on that, but we're going to come back to it in future sessions. So now let's look at the expenses column of the worksheet, starting with the establishment costs. And this is the bulk of where we want to spend our time this evening because, well, it's important decisions, right? You can refer to the various line items there, from the plants themselves to whatever you plan to do for weed control and pest protection. And actually, when you get right down to it, this is where we start putting pen to paper for the costs associated then with your weed management plan, your pest management plan. Those are both crucial documents that every grower really should develop as part of their hazelnut project. We'll mention it here and talk about it more at the end of our talk, but this section includes expenses like rent, initial soil tests, the maintenance activities like mowing and weeding, fertilizer, and then we account for some loss and of course the need to replant. Finally, this last section of the enterprise worksheet, this contains some of those operational costs. So things like labor for harvesting or a machine recharge if mechanically harvesting, drying the nuts, husking to get down to nice, clean, in-shell nuts ready to sell to a customer for cracking or processing or further value added. Like before, more to come on this particular section, pardon me, but I wanted to be sure I went over that entire worksheet. So, and it's just a second to wet my whistle here. So before any plant goes into the ground, and the first step in the planning process, yes, is determining your goal, but then we need to figure out if hazelnuts even make sense where you're thinking of planting them. So for example, hazelnuts are not a true riparian species, and they don't like really wet feet. They're found more in upland positions in the landscape, but they do really well on the fringe between the forest and the prairie, and they're really even considered kind of an oak savanna understory crop. Now, for any crop that we have, matching the crop to the soil is important because not all plants do well on all soils. In recognition of that, I want to spend just a couple of minutes sharing with you how you can determine the appropriateness of hazelnuts for the site that you might have in mind. But first, just to note that what I'm showing you is a little bit incomplete because I couldn't take screenshots on the NRCS system. Furthermore, I have done a short video that should be released relatively soon that kind of gives you a step-by-step how to navigate the NRCS web soil survey so that you can develop your own soil report and then cross-reference with the Iowa Woodland Suitability Guide. And when I have that ready to publish, I'll be sure to send you guys the link because that really is a cool little 20-minute video in terms of how you can do it yourself. So, okay. So this is the web soil survey, and this is a really handy site where you, from the comfort of your very own home, can check out the different soils across the United States and their territories. And one of the things that it allows is you to zoom in to your particular area and highlight that area and then come up with the soils that are part of that area. Now, this is an example here of what the report might look like. This one is for the Del Lawrence hazelnut test plot down in Marion, Iowa, Lynn County. I don't know how well you can see it, but on that piece of paper, there is a blue square that highlights Del's property. And the place where the hazelnuts are planted is that middle part of that square You can see the north part is wooded area with the home and a shed. Then there's an open area right next to some river bottom there. And then of course trees on the bottom part of that square, or the south part of that property there. And so the hazelnuts are planted east to west in that old pasture area there, just to provide some context and for where that's at. So then when we look at this entire square, and incidentally, you can't necessarily zoom all the way down to just the small patch. Like let's say you were just going to do this for your garden or something like that. You wouldn't be able to zoom all the way down to your garden patch and see what the soils are going to be like. Because what's going to happen is it gets too fine a data. So it needs to back out to a larger pixel size, and then you can get the soils. So in this particular case, we have to get the soil type for that whole entire section. And then I zoomed in on the right hand side here to then see, well, what is the predominant soil type just where those hazelnuts are planted? And in this particular case, it would be 8B, and then maybe a little bit of 485, but mostly this 8B. So part of the soil survey report is going to have a map legend that's going to be able to show you what all the different symbols mean and how to essentially read the map. But then we're going to get to the meat of the report, which tells you what those map symbol units are. So in this case, 8B is Judson silty clay loam, 2 to 5% slopes. And then it tells you how many acres in that AOI stands for area of interest. And that's just that highlighted square. So in this particular case, there's roughly 2.9 acres of this 8B soil, Judson silty clay loam. And then as a percentage of that overall box that we drew, it's 17%. But now that we know that it's Judson silty clay loam, that information is valuable to us because we can use that information. And the way that we use that information is with a document called the Iowa DNR Woodland Suitability Guide. If you were to Google this or do a search for this, I should say, on your computer, you should be able to find it. You can either search for the Iowa DNR Woodland Suitability Guide 2014, 2017. There have been some updates, but you should get something that looks like this document. And the way that this is broken down is you will locate your soil type in column 1 of table 1, which is right down here at the bottom. So all of the soil types in alphabetical order, are going to be listed. And then on the right-hand side, it's going to give what's called a CSG, where if you look up here, that stands for your Conservation Suitability Group. And so if we then look, here are all the different soils in the state of Iowa. Nicolet, Okoboji, those are some heavy soils up where I live. All these different types of soils. So if we were to find Judson, oh, it's not on there. Well, that didn't really work out. Okay, so once we know what the CSG is, that Conservation Suitability Group, which is this right-hand column here, then the end of this report tells you what that Conservation Suitability Group is. In this case, it's moderately wet. It's going to give a description of that Conservation Suitability Group. In this case, these deep soils are somewhat poorly drained with seasonal high water table of 1 to 3.5 feet during the growing season. And then it's also going to give you recommendations for hardwoods, conifers, and shrubs that would make sense for that soil type. So this is a really great way that just from the comfort of your own home, you can get a somewhat informed idea of what some of these species might do on your particular piece of ground. If we move on to the Conservation Suitability Group 2, this is wet, and you can see the options that we have significantly reduced in terms of the hardwoods, those conifers, and then those shrubs. And then you can see some of these really odd different types of conservation suitability groups, these wet calcareous soils, the saline and sodic soils. And again, not a whole lot of really good options there. Okay, any questions on the web soil survey, from the NRCS, the Woodland Suitability Guide, and the quick and easy way to do at least a cursory level investigation of whatever the crop may be, if it's going to work on your piece of ground? Okay. Well, what do you say we jump right back into it? So now that we've determined that perhaps hazelnuts will grow where we want them to grow, let's shift back to our enterprise worksheet and the very first expense, plant material. So what are you going to plant? And we come to the point in the Hazelnut Academy where we have to have the quote unquote talk. Specifically the talk about what we're going to plant. So what is out there is a combination of seedlings, experimental genotypes, and some limited cultivars. So as I've mentioned time and time again, what is your goal? Do you want to grow seedlings in a production setting? Nope, that's not going to cut it. Seedlings in a production setting is not going to be feasible. They should certainly be included as a source of pollen. But if all we want is pollen, then we can find some really inexpensive seedlings from the Iowa State Forest Nursery. They're about $1 a piece, and they're a really great source for pollen in an eventual production setting, but not from those seedlings. So if open pollinated seedlings is not the answer, then what? Well, if what you're after is production, then I think you certainly want to consider some of the experimental genotypes or some of the limited cultivars that are available on the nursery page of the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative. Just search for Midwest hazelnuts. And so we're going to talk a little bit about, I guess what you could say is what's out there. So the cultivars that are available include Grand Traverse, which is a cultivar in the public domain, so it doesn't require any patent fees or royalties. Then there's the Beast, which is a variety that's being tested at the Joint Performance Trial. Well, in fact, both of them are included in the Joint Performance Trials, the hazelnut test plots in the Upper Midwest. The Beast has been released at the University of Nebraska through their Hazelnut Consortium partnership with Oregon State University and Rutgers University. Incidentally, both of them are available in limited numbers. You can see those bare root plants there. Both of them are available in limited numbers through Great Plains Nursery in Nebraska. And they're actually scaling up production quite a bit. So those should be available for you. Now, it's important to note that neither of these are proven varieties, so to speak. They are being tested, and we hope that they might eventually be worthy of recommending to growers, but we simply don't know. And that's where cooperation from growers like you comes into play. By working together, sharing our knowledge of how some of these plants grow and produce, we can really accelerate the adoption of hazelnuts as a viable perennial crop on the landscape. Okay, so now on to the experimental genotypes. As I mentioned previously, these are the plants that, for whatever reason, looked good at a university research planting or an individual grower that had an outstanding plant. And I think we're up to almost 30 right now. As this slide shows here, in this case, the Del Lawrence planting near Marion, Iowa, we have all these different experimental genotypes being grown to see how well they do. And you can see the names here from Marion, Frank, ALD, which stands for Aldara, ANW, that stands for Andrew, and a few others. Now, these are all selections from Grimo Nut Nursery in Ontario, Canada. The one labeled OSU, that's the Beast cultivar from the Hazelnut Consortium. And then GT is Grand Traverse. And then the others are selections from the University of Minnesota or Wisconsin from research plantings or just collaborating growers in some cases. And even we have a few of the newest releases from the Hazelnut Consortium that are really geared for more growers in the mid-Atlantic regions, like maybe from the Carolinas up to New Jersey or so. And those are those Rutgers 1, Rutgers 6, Rutgers 5. But some of them might be considered on the fringe of where they're going to do best around here in the Midwest. So we definitely want to try them out. And I think this winter is going to be a really key test winter because we had prolonged periods of 30 mile an hour, 30 degree below wind chill for almost 3 days. And so that level of just real deep cold for that long, we'll see how they do. We'll see. So what's a grower to do really if we don't have proven cultivars to grow? And the question then becomes, are we stuck with seedlings? And the first is be patient. And I know that's difficult because that's difficult for me too. But be patient because improved varieties are coming. And then second, regardless of your goal, seedlings really should be part of the mix. So for example, even if production is your goal, one good strategy is to get started today on a limited basis with some seedlings to build your skill set, but more importantly, as a source of pollen for some of these improved varieties once they become available. You also might consider joining with the Iowa Nut Growers Association as an on-farm collaborator and help us gather data to see how well these various plants do across the landscape. But more importantly, help us to validate some of these assumptions that have been made in the enterprise worksheet from earlier. Start small. I think that's the key takeaway here. Gain some experience, plan for the day when you're tasked with establishing an acre of hazelnuts, some 500 plants, maybe 700 plants with mixed cultivars that have some reasonableness of uniformity and then thus hopefully profitability. So let's return back for just a moment here to our enterprise worksheet. This next section is going to contain the bulk of our establishment costs after paying for the plants. And if you really look at it, it's really a manifestation of your weed and pest management plan, as well as your maintenance plan, I guess. But this section is going to include those expenses like your weed barrier if you use it, irrigation, tree tubes if you use them, stakes, planting costs, things like that. I threw a soil test in there, certainly, so that you can get an idea of what the soil fertility is at the time of establishment. If you need to do some amending to the soil, ideally, it's best to do that, obviously, before plants go in the ground so that you can actually mix any nutrients or amendments you might need into the soil. So that's the section, excuse me, on expenses. So let's talk a little bit about site prep and layout. It's a good time to remind ourselves, like always, what is the goal? Is the goal a research planting, commercial production planting? Perhaps you're establishing an agroforestry practice that incorporates hazelnut shrubs. Well, the spacing between rows and then plants within the same row is really going to differ if we're fixing to establish a research planting that would typically be your 15 feet between rows and then 10 feet between plants versus a production planting that would have a much narrower distance between rows, maybe 10 feet or even less, and then spacing between plants in the same row of 2, 3, 4 feet, somewhere in there. So really, basically, I don't want to say polar opposites, but what is your goal? Because it's really going to make a difference, right? Remember, in a production setting, we want to minimize space not growing hazelnuts, right? So wide rows that grow grass instead of hazelnuts, not so desirable. However, If the goal happens to be to graze animals between the rows, then a happy compromise might be in order, right? Again, it all depends on your goals. Regardless of your goals, access to water is going to be important. So seedlings really need water those first 2 years of establishment. So close proximity to a well is going to allow for the use of irrigation in irrigation systems and equipment. While if you're out in the middle of nowhere, you're probably going to have to haul in water from somewhere unless you time it right and you get those good rains, which did happen to me when I first established in 2005. But by the same token, I have also established in almost drought conditions that did require hauling water. In fact, that's how we water the hazelnut test plot here, is with a 500-gallon water tank and buckets. Okay, weed management is such an important component to the planting process. I guess stated simply, how are you going to control competition from sod-forming grasses? How are you going to do it? Will you use mulch? Maybe the landscape fabric? Perhaps you're going to simply spray a little Roundup next to each plant when the grass and weeds get too tall. Maybe you have a weed eater or a weed whacker. Personally, I've spent many hours weed eating the grass around each plant. My original planting was established on my parents' farm, and my mother thinks that the farm needs to look like a golf course, so keeping it tidy was extremely important for her, less so for me, but regardless, it had to be done. So finally, harvesting and maintenance. These things have to be considered when we're planning. So if you intend to someday have a mechanical harvester come out, and either you own one or have a custom harvester come, you need to be sure that there's enough room at the end of your rows just for that machine to turn around. Same with steep terrain. Do you have steep terrain that might get the harvester quote unquote hung up and unable to move? These are big pieces of equipment that aren't small, and they can weigh as much as a truck or more. So your maintenance plan is going to really dictate things like mowing, weed control, either through reducing weeds and grass with things like weed barrier or mulch, to options like chemical weed control or mechanical removal. Whatever it is, you can't just ignore it. It needs to be addressed. And there's going to be costs associated with those activities, and they need to be accounted for. So focusing on site prep specifically, several items I want to point out when you're investigating that site preparation is that previous crop or the site condition. Are we planting into pasture or sod, or was the previous crop corn or soybeans? Remember, if we disturb the soil through some sort of tillage use, how are we going to control the resulting flush of weeds that will emerge? Because that absolutely will happen. So soil testing and adding any amendments if it's shown. This needs to, well, I've said this at conferences and I've been called out, so I'm not going to say it. And now you're going to be like, well, wait a second. What do you usually say that you got called out at a conference for? I'll say it. Okay. So I was under the impression that boron was important as a trace mineral, and it's not readily mobile in the soil. So you basically need to incorporate it into the soil profile. And so when I got my soil test, I asked them to do a boron to see how much boron I had in there. And it did show that I needed just a little bit. But Lois Brown, the University of Minnesota, thinks that that is irrelevant, essentially. And so she knows more than I do. So I probably shouldn't have brought it up, but I opened my big mouth. I talked about it and then I said I wasn't going to share, and that probably piqued your interest anyway. So more to be determined and more research to do, as a university researcher would say. Finally, how are the plants going to be established? Are we digging a hole with a shovel for bare root dormant plants? Perhaps the use of a tree transplanter if we're talking about standardized liners. All of this and more is going to have an impact on our planting. And so with that, I've actually got a couple of examples of plantings that I've done that kind of provide some context for what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to kind of run through them a little bit and explain to you, I guess, how I did it. So the Nut Haven planting here, this was planted in the fall of of 2006. This was my first experience with landscape fabric and drip tape. These hazelnuts were planted directly over a buried barn in an old livestock lot. And the ground prep was we glyphosated, we mowed, we planted, put down the irrigation hose, and then put the landscape fabric over the top. And then we mulched along the edges. And there's a difference there I'll point out here, but just remember that we mulched along the edges. And so here we can see the plants spaced out there, the landscape fabric, the grass between the rows. Again, remember there's an old barn buried underneath this area here. You can see there the mulch along the edge. That's what's just weighting it down. And you can see we let the grass get pretty tall here before we clipped it down. And then this is 10, 15 years later. This is a local community college ag agent. And today, right now, it's completely grown together. You would not be able to walk really through. I mean, you can walk through it, but you can't walk through it without having to duck your head, and it's completely filled in the row is essentially what I'm trying to say. These were the plants that we established there, 4-inch banded pots, approximately 9 inches deep. And you can see some nice root systems there. There's roots coming out of the bottom of these 9-inch pots here. This all came from Tom Wall at Red Fern Farm down in Wapello, Iowa. I think he's one of the greatest agroforestry growers, Tom and Kathy both, in the Midwest. Got a lot of respect for them, and they have a lot of good stuff and good quality stock. They do a lot with chestnuts and some other things like that. Well, this is a handy dandy, the tool right here. There's a little bit of a story behind this. My brother-in-law runs a steel dealership. And so I was shooting the breeze one day while he was doing something to the chainsaw and looking at some of the things up on the wall, the weed eaters, chainsaws, you name it. And I saw this little unit with this little auger on it. And I thought, well, hot dang. And so what it is the power head is just that. It's a power head that you can put all sorts of different attachments. You can put a weed eater on it. You can put an auger on it. You can put a power broom. I think you can put a pole trimmer on it, maybe all sorts of different things. And so when I saw it, my eyes lit up and I said, oh boy, that would work just slicker than snot for those little 4-inch banded pots, 9 inches deep. I'll be able to go just lickety split. And sure enough, it has worked pretty well with that type of a plant, a 4-inch banded pot, whether they were 9 inches deep or 5 inches deep, whatever the case may be. I have the arrow pointing to the drip tape irrigation line that's underneath the landscape fabric there. And so this particular planting, incidentally, this is where I live now. This was originally done for a neighbor. This was what I would consider the gold standard with landscape fabric, the drip tape irrigation, the whole 9 yards. And then so many years later, I ended up buying the property for him. And it is now what we call Nut Haven, where nuts roam free. Okay. So then another planting to contrast. This is what we call the herbs planting. This was planted in 2007. Again, this is an old farmstead. Hazelnuts are planted on top of where an old house used to be. So the house was burned up and buried many years before even 2000. The ground prep was glyphosate, and then we're going to mow. And here we plowed, we disked, then we laid the landscape fabric and then the irrigation drip tape over the top of it. Oh, look at that young buck thinking, hey, I'm on my way to making $1 million growing hazelnuts 15 years ago. Holy moly. Anyways, so here's Dad. This gave him an excuse to get out the old Alice and the 3-bottom plow, turn over the soil there a little bit. And now this is an interesting site because as this picture depicts, on the right-hand side, we established some seedlings just into the grass sod there. And then on the left-hand side, we glyphosate, we mowed it, We flipped it over. We then come through and we disked it and to get it nice and smooth. And then we rented a machine that will actually lay the landscape fabric. And so this machine is pretty slick because you can use many different widths of landscape fabric, but it has some coulters in the front, which will move the soil away to create a small furrow. Then those wheels keep the landscape fabric pushed down into the furrow, as then those coulters at the rear of the machine pull dirt over the top. And so as you can kind of hopefully see on the right-hand side there, where we've already run the machine, it essentially buries the edges of that landscape fabric. And I'll come back to that in a minute, but that's something that's kind of key to keep suckers under control. Here's a great example of it. You can see that while the ends are not buried, we had to put just some mulch on the end to keep the wind from getting up underneath the ends. The edges are buried in the dirt itself. So then we put mulch over the top, put the drip tape irrigation over the top. You can see the water wagon there. And then to this day now, this particular site, it really is a night and day difference. The side where the landscape fabric was placed, where the drip irrigation was utilized, beautiful rows of hazelnut shrubs. On the right-hand side, where the hazelnuts were planted into the existing sod, without any sort of protection like the landscape fabric from the grass, very sporadic. There's lots of shrubs missing. They just haven't done as well, not as vigorous, because they're always in competition with that turf grass sod. Okay, so returning once again back to our enterprise budget. There we go. Our next set of expenses are going to be ongoing labor and maintenance costs associated with growing hazelnuts. And this is going to include things like rent, mowing, weed control, spraying, for example, even replacing dead plants, and then fertilizing as well. More is going to be covered at future Hazelnut Academy sessions, but I did want to highlight this section for you all for reference. So, okay, so finally, to wrap up planning, anytime we start talking about management, we need to get kind of back to basics and ask ourselves, what is the goal? Knowing what you're trying to achieve, it'll influence the time, money, the effort that you expend dealing with your own particular situation. So just again, as an example, if you're growing nuts for your own consumption or for wildlife, you might have a very different concept of maintenance. You may let more grass grow, more weeds grow in and around the hazelnuts, right? But if you're production focused and your goal is production, that might include some pretty intense mowing or weed control to maximize nut production and productivity. The same applies for supplemental fertilizer. Some growers may never need fertilizer if the goal is not production, while others, at the very least, are going to need to replace what is taking off of the shrub from nuts and husks, just the nutrients that are inherently latent within the nuts and the husks. So it really depends on your goal. And I know that I feel like I'm beating a dead horse when I say that, but I cannot stress that enough, that knowing what the goal is of your planting can have such a profound impact, because it impacts almost every single decision that you're going to make, from to where you plant, to the plants that you grow, and how successful you are in the end. So that concludes session 3 of the Hazelnut Academy. I want to thank you all for joining. I did make a resources page here. I made it a little bit larger than last time. So this is where you can find the Landowner's Guide to Perennial Crop Options, the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative, the Hazelnut Consortium, the Iowa Nut Growers YouTube page, the Hazelnut Project on Facebook, and then that Iowa Nut Growers Association website. Okay, let's talk. Who has questions? I did that good a job. All right. So go forth and be prosperous. Oh, Doug, you're talking, but I think your mic's not on. See if there's a, oh, actually, hold on a second. I might be able to unmute you. Wait, 3 shakes of a lamb's tail here. Oh, I tried to. There you go.
There. Um, Jeff, my question, on the soil testing, I'm, when you test a farm field, you take so many tests every so many feet. Yeah, and I'm assuming that's the same process we would use for, like, say I'm working with a half-acre ground. Is that what you're thinking? I mean, it just X number of them and so many feet, or what do you think is the best approach on soil testing?
Well, the first thing that I would say is you really need to take a step back and look at that entire area that you're going to be planting into and really see if there's any areas that are different. Most likely it's not going to be uniform. Maybe it is. So is there a low spot? Is there a high spot? Is there something that you can tell that's particularly different? And so it's particularly important then that you ensure that you get samples from both of those areas so that you get a true representative sample. Now, you also, if you want to manage down to that level, you might also consider just taking a soil sample of an area that's inherently different, because you might want to manage that different. However, if you're not going to manage it differently, if you're going to manage that entire area the same, then it's inherent that we try to get as representative a sample as possible. Does that make sense, I guess? Or
It does. It does. I've got some upper ground, and then when we first started cleaning this property up, there was a lot of erosion.
Sure.
And so we've done erosion control over the years. So I know it's brought a lot of different soils down. And so, all right. That helps.
Fantastic. So our next session, we're going to get into planting and establishment and some things like that, some maintenance stuff. So we'll have some videos to share, and I'll be sure to get not only so I'll get session 2 posted. I should get that posted tomorrow. And then I'll get this one posted here sometime early next week, so that everybody can get caught up. I know that we have some other folks that couldn't make it, and they're chomping at the bits for that session 2 as well. So expect that here shortly. So thanks, Ed. You have a great evening. See you next week. Doug, hope to see you again next week, and go forth.
You will. Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Take care. Bye now.